All right, y'all, welcome back. This is chapter 47, Ethnic Mobilization and Ethnic Conflict by James Fearon. I really liked this chapter. It's very easy to read and very straightforward. I liked the way he presented this, so I hope you learned a lot from this chapter. All right, let's dive in. So, part one is just an introduction, and he lays out basically four questions that we're going to be looking at over the chapter. One, why are politics so often organized around ethnicity? Two, why is ethnicity more polarized in some countries and not others? How do we account for this polarization in the same country over time? Why does ethnicity become more important or less important? And then, under what conditions does this polarization lead to violence? So, section two, some stylized facts about the politicization. Jeez, I'm so sorry, I've got the hiccups. Some stylized facts about the politicization of ethnicity. And their definition here on page 853 says ethnicity is politicized when political coalitions are organized along ethnic lines or when access to political or economic benefits depends on ethnicity. So there are a very small handful of states that you could say don't really have ethnicities or ethnic minorities. The Koreas, North Korea and South Korea, Iceland and Japan, arguably, there are some smaller sort of like island members that see themselves as a different ethnic group from the mainland Japanese, but it's 99.9999%, are Japanese. And most of these countries, yeah, even Iceland, tend to be rather xenophobic, rather sort of unwilling to accept outsiders into their societies. They have very high restrictions on immigration and things of that sort. Um, So how many ethnic groups are there, and to what extent do they exist? There are hundreds, maybe thousands across the world of ethnic and indigenous groups. Um, Fearon tried to sort of answer this question in 2003, and he sort of took a whole bunch of data from 160 different countries and tried to find groups that that could be classified as ethnic that made up at least 1% of the population. So, sort of large enough to be politically or economically relevant. Um, he finds that there's an average of five per country in his study across the 160 states. So that's 800 just right there. He finds that there's regional differences, right? So there's about three in the Western countries, or the sort of stable democracies, the rich democracies, versus eight in sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa, fewer than half have an actual majority group that makes up over 50% of the population, and only one has a dominant group. Rwanda, who has 90% or more, is what they call a dominant group. Um, and Rwanda, as we know, is where the Hutu and Tutsis had their sort of brutal, absolutely brutal ethnic conflict in the 90s. In the West, every state has a majority, and 60% have a dominant group of 90% or more. So when you think of Europe, it's very white until you get to sort of the Mediterranean area. Hmm. Um, let's see where in societies is access to goods, public benefits, and sort of jobs and things of that sort based on ethnicity. This is largely in Africa and in Southeast Asia, much less so in the West. Um, but it still certainly exists, right? So, as we know, um, for minorities in America. They've had a really tough access to housing, public benefits, social welfare, the court, geez, you name it, they haven't had access to it historically, at least. And so, while this still exists largely in Africa and Southeast Asia, there are arguments to be made that it still exists in the West as well, just to a lesser extent. So, how do we explain sort of the rise of ethnicity as a political movement? Because we didn't really see much of this pre 1800s. And prior to ethnicity becoming so sort of viable as a political organizing movement, most states were based on class or religion. There was, huge Marxist movements. Of course, societies were based on religion, whether Protestant versus Catholic or Christian versus Islam, or, Catholic versus Orthodox, or, whatever it is. There's a lot of schisms, right? But that's sort of the way that society was organized, until a couple of things happened. One, industrialism, and two, colonialism, and the new boundaries that colonialism sort of arbitrarily drew created incentives for sort of political entrepreneurs to use race or ethnicity, to structure their societies and ask for public goods. So, let's see. Part 3. Some stylized facts about ethnic violence. So we do know that while ethnic violence does occur, it's not as sort of common as people probably envision it. When you look at the number of groups that sort of are contiguous to each other or abut against each other versus the actual instances of violence, violence is really, really rare. Um, but it can become extraordinarily brutal, when it does occur. And I think that sort of drives people's memories of some of the worst ethnic violences we know about, like Rwanda and others. And some that are even continuing today, like in Myanmar, or what they call Burma. Places like that are ethnic violence is still thriving. We know it's happening in places like Sudan, and South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so, there are worries about this sort of thing. And it also drives problems like terrorism, right? From the kidnapping of hundreds of girls from schools in sort of Western Africa by Islamists, to the blowing up of buildings, by far right Christians, as has happened in the U.S., or by Islamists. There's been a lot of problems, in the past. So, um, it's good to know sort of about these things and how they occur, but it's also good to know that it's not nearly as common as people think it occurs. Um, the ethnic violence that does occur is generally not between groups. It's generally what happens is it's a state that's suppressing a group, or it's a state trying to repress a rebel group. So either they're worried about their votes, or they're concerns about goods distribution, or the rebels are just so fed up that they're trying to take over the state. And so that makes up the majority of ethnic group conflict. We also know that ethnic fractionalization, sort of the proportion of your society that makes up one group or another or that sort of thing, it doesn't actually increase the odds of either international or civil war, um, as compared to a state that doesn't really have ethnic conflict, right? Or a 50-50 split versus a 90-10 split. It doesn't really have any effect on the likelihood of war or of civil war. And a lot of the statistical research, at least, finds that there's really four main determinants of ethnic violence, and at least on the sort of state level, right? The first is the size of the nation. The larger the size, the more violence. Whether this is because there's more groups competing with each other, or there's more distributional goods to be had because it's such a large state, or because there's more jobs to be had in such a large state, I don't know. But state size is one of the main sort of coefficients. Second is GDP per capita. We know that the poorer a state tends to be, very poor societies tend to have more ethnic conflict. Recently independent states have more conflict. So those states that broke away during sort of anti-colonialism movements in the 40s, 50s, 60s, sort of like India and many of the African countries, had real serious problems with ethnicity and ethnic violence after their independence movements. And a lot of this was related to sort of fights about voting systems and about patronage and about who gets to run what mechanisms of government, and about regional distribution, and fights over infrastructure and all kinds of stuff. So when the new states are developing, there's a lot of fear about what's going to happen due to new rules being instituted, right? And sometimes it looks like it's more valuable to rebel or cause violence to show how determined you are, in a brand new state where the sort of the distributional benefits haven't been determined yet. And then we also know that oil-rich states tend to have more violence. And again, it's because there's more to steal, basically. There's more patronage, there's more corruption to be had, there's all of that stuff. So, okay, so what are the potential explanations for the politicization of ethnicity? The first is primordialism, which has largely been turned away from. This is the idea that sort of ethnicity is unchangeable, and it's so important in your social and cultural life that it naturally extends into political life. But this doesn't really explain why ethnicity has become more important over time, nor does it explain sort of variance in time and space. So most people have kind of gotten rid of primordialism. The political economy approaches, there's a couple different studies. Robushka and Shepsley from 72 argue that democracy basically can't survive in an ethnically fractionalized state, because polarized policies are eventually going to lead to an unwillingness to compromise through elections, and increase the benefits of rebellion or violence against other groups. This again has largely been discredited, especially if you look like countries like Belgium, Switzerland, the United States, Canada, which is a huge French population. There's not a lot of evidence for this. And then Fearon, the same guy that's writing this article in 1998, makes a similar argument about nascent democracies. Nascent means brand new or just birthed. So new democracies, ethnic groups, basically the majority, can't make a credible enough commitment to the minority that they won't just steal from the state, and that they'll give them long-term public goods benefits. And so you a lot of times see the other side, the minority group, just exhort to violence. The third approach they suggest is the modernist approach. So I like this approach. It focuses on the incentives of the political entrepreneurs, Again, this class is all about incentives, right? Focuses on the incentives of political entrepreneurs to use ethnicity to sort of advance their political or their economic agendas or interests, right? Um, and if there isn't really an incentive to do it that way, and the better way to do it is to, you know, sort of coalesce around class or some other cleavage, that's what they'll do. Um, and basically, they argue that modernization caused a lot of these problems, right? Modernization and colonialism, um, economic modernization and industrialism caused sort of mass migration and urbanization, right? And often the political goods and the economic goods that were doled out, like jobs or social benefits or things like that, were based on one's language or culture. So if you look even in the United States at a place like Chicago, which had enormous immigration, you know, if you were white, you were more likely to get jobs and benefits. And then if you spoke English, you were more likely to get jobs and benefits. And you saw a lot of groups coalesce around each other in neighborhoods um, because those neighbors knew their language, whether Lithuanian or Romanian or um, I don't know, French, German, whatever it was, because they were escaping Europe and working in sort of the beef factories, right? The plants. So if you read, good Lord, what was the name of that book? It's absolutely amazing. Um, Shit. Well, that's okay. Maybe I'll remember it later. But it's about a Lithuanian immigrant family who moved to Chicago. Um, um, and worked in the killing fields, basically the killing factory floor um, of these meat plants, uh, and it was a very interesting, beautifully written book. But anyway, it's sort of this idea that you can only get benefits if you speak the language, and so it made it a lot easier in these urban areas to recruit people around their language and ethnic affiliations. But it doesn't explain colonialism and its effects on India and Africa and Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, and so Bates in 1993 suggests that there's really two conditions under which ethnic groups coalesce. The first is language barriers as an access to goods. And then the second was colonialism pitting different regions against each other in the fight for, you know, jobs or especially infrastructure, because there was very little money going around. And so there were fights across the regions about who would get the money. Okay, so part five is explanations for ethnic violence. Horowitz in 1985, in a very famous book that I've read a few times, he basically says that ethnicity as a cleavage tends to lead to greater violence, right? Because ethnicity has this sort of kinship, blood affiliation, right? And that it makes it more personal. And it's like you killed my brother or my cousin, so it justifies the sense of violence or killing another, um, an outsider who killed a member of your group. And then in 2004, Fearon again um, basically makes an argument we talked about a little above, that the majority group may not be able to sort of sate the minority group's preference when it comes to policies and public goods with enough credible commitment in the future sense, um, to devolve power through things like federalism, because it takes a long time, right? And so, because the minority's power relationship in a society might degrade over time, and they might lose their chance, um, they have this one shot, and they might take it, right? And we talked a little bit about that really early in the semester too. And then there's sociological literature. So we do know that, you know, through surveys and experiments, that people tend to discount news about their own group and sort of amplify news about the outgroup. So we tend to see this with sort of white supremacist groups post 9/11, On the left, there's a lot of concern about white supremacists in the military and in these sort of militia groups across the states, whereas the white sort of sees them as the right, and which is generally white people, tend to see them as heroes, and they make claims about Second Amendment and et cetera. So we sort of see this in our own society as well. And then in the conclusion, just 2 points. The first is that there is, again, more evidence that ethnic fractionalization tends to reduce public goods provision, right? So social safety nets, any goods for the minority group, the majority suddenly gets real antsy about sharing, right? So we see that again, like we talked about last time, not only on the international scene, but in the U.S., we see it across the states. We see it across counties. We see it across localities and school districts. Where there is more ethnic fractionalization, where there are more Black people and Hispanic people, you see less social services and less willingness to give. We also find a negative relationship between ethnic fractionalization and economic growth. And they're still trying to tease out why we are finding this statistical relationship. So I don't really know the answer, but more to come, right? All right. Thanks so much for being here for this one. This was number 14, I believe. So that just leaves chapter 48, Dan Reiter's and Alan Stam's Democracy, Peace, and War. So have a great day. I'll see you for the next one.